Hello and welcome to the CVL podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition in the brain, and with each episode we'll be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is the CVL podcast.
In this episode, we meet with Dr. Aaron Heller, an associate professor at the University of Miami's McKnight Brain Institute. Dr. Heller is a clinical psychologist and affective neuroscientist who received his bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He did his postdoctoral training at Weill Cornell Medical College. His work integrates neuroimaging and real-time mobile health methods to track emotion and behavior in humans to better understand the biobehavioral mechanisms that give rise to the development of depression and anxiety, and conversely, well-being. His work uses computational and data-driven analytic approaches to identify the features of daily experience most linked to well-being and the neural mechanisms that support such individual differences. Today's conversation with Dr. Heller covers a range of very interesting topics, beginning with understanding the distinction between emotions and mood states. We also talk about how the neural circuits of the brain differ between individuals with depression and those without the disorder. Dr. Heller touches on how stress impacts brain function and structure, particularly in the regions involved in emotional processing. We also talk about how our emotional states on average change across the lifespan, and we touch on how these changes might relate to cognitive health in older age. Prior research has shown that emotion is tied to memory, so we spent some time discussing how emotions influence memory formation and recall. Finally, Dr. Heller introduces us to his lab's methods for tracking emotion and behavior. He talks about a very interesting mobile health approach where researchers monitor participants' locations over time while collecting regular emotional state surveys. We didn't go into very much detail during the episode on this specific topic, so I wanted to briefly touch on some of those findings here. Using this mobile health approach, Dr. Heller found that individuals who experienced more movement in novel locations, meaning they were going to new places more often, reported more positive emotions during the experiment, suggesting that there may be a potential link between exposure to new environments and positive emotional states. Dr. Heller's research offers valuable insights into how our brains process emotions, which has implications for understanding mental health, improving treatment strategies, and enhancing overall well-being. So now, let's begin our discussion with Dr. Heller.
Dr. Heller, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, before we begin delving into the work you've been doing, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to this area of research?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Bay Area. I went to undergrad at UC Berkeley, where I studied psychology, and worked in a cognitive neuroscience lab where we did research on auditory cognition. And then I actually went and traveled in South America for about a year afterward, and came back, worked in a lab at UC Davis that was focused on the cognitive neuroscience of memory. But all the while, my initial kind of motivation to join psychology and pursue it was really to kind of work with people and stuff like that. So I'd always thought about pursuing a career in clinical psychology, even though my research passion was in cognitive neuroscience. And so after the 2 years I spent in Davis as a postbac doing work in the cognitive neuroscience of memory, I applied and got into a clinical psychology program at the University of Wisconsin, whose research was focused on affective neuroscience, so the neuroscience of emotion, particularly as it pertains to clinical phenomena, emotion regulation, stuff like that. So I uprooted myself from California, where I had lived my whole life, and moved to Wisconsin, to Madison, where I spent 6 years pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology. And there, my work was really focused on affective neuroscience in clinical populations like depression. But one thing that I really found as I went further through the program was that most of the designs that we use to elicit emotion in people while we were scanning them, I found to be a little bit lacking in terms of ecological validity. That is that like the pictures we were showing them or the movies we were showing them, I didn't really feel like they were eliciting human emotion in the way that we all know subjectively human emotion kind of happens and what it feels like. So I started to, while in grad school, I started to think about how might we elicit emotion in naturalistic contexts in a way that's more real, that's more veridical and valid. And so that led me to start to do work in, mobile tracking and trying to understand emotion in daily life. I went to Cornell, the medical school in Manhattan, for my clinical internship, which was a full clinical year, kind of like a residency. And then I continued to do research as a postdoc at Cornell, where I continued to be thinking about and setting the groundwork for some of these studies that I've done in mobile tracking, stuff like that. And in 2015, I started a position at the University of Miami in the Department of Psychology as an assistant professor, where all of my work since then has come from.
Yeah, super cool. And we'll get into learning more about that mobile tracking device. But before we get into that, could you define or explain what is affective neuroscience?
Yeah, so affective neuroscience is essentially the neuroscientific study of emotion. So what in the brain happens when people experience emotion? What brain regions become active or engaged? What brain circuits become active or engaged when we feel something? And also, how does the brain differ in response to emotional cues if somebody is, let's say, depressed compared to somebody who is not depressed? And so affective neuroscience is a large umbrella term to categorize any work that's focused on the brain bases of emotion.
Got it. And I know there's a distinction between emotions and something called mood states. Mm-hmm. So can you help differentiate would you define emotions versus mood state?
Yeah, so an emotion is a state, an affective state that is relatively short-lasting, maybe on the order of hours or a full day, that has an event that precipitated it. So an emotion is something that we respond to, that we have a subjective feeling in response to, that is in response to something that happened. It doesn't necessarily last super long, but it is kind of defined as something, as a subjective experience in response to a specific event. A mood is a more diffuse affective state that lasts longer, on the order of days or even weeks, that doesn't necessarily have a clear precipitant, that doesn't necessarily have a clear stimulus that caused the mood state. So it's, emotions can affect our moods. Like if I have an emotional response to an argument with my wife or something like that, that can affect my mood for days after. But the intense emotional experience will have subsided and you'll have a more low-grade mood that's lasting for days or weeks after that.
And now going back to the methods that you talked about for the research that you do, could you kind of elaborate more on how that mobile health device works that you mentioned?
So most of the work that we have done combines what we call geolocation tracking and experience sampling of emotion. So for geolocation tracking, what we do is we download an app onto people's phones that samples their location, their latitude, longitude location, every couple minutes. It's also signaled by the accelerometer on their phone. So if they start running or moving, then the phone signals to the app that I'm moving and to sample my location. So that gives a readout, basically a minute-by-minute readout of where the person is over the entire course of the period that we're collecting data from them, typically for us on the order of maybe 4 months or so. And the other ecological data source that we collect is what we call experience sampling of emotion. And that's really simply we text people every day or every other day or sometimes more than once a day. And the text message contains a link that the subject clicks on that brings them to a page, a survey page, where they have a very brief survey to rate their current level of positive and negative emotion. So how happy are you? How sad are you right now? How relaxed are you right now? How anxious are you right now, etc. And that allows us to get a sense of what their current emotional state is, whether they're in the office or at home or, at school or whatever, how they're feeling in the moment right then and there.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that your research focuses on is the relationship between emotion and psychopathology. What can you tell us about the role of individual differences in emotional processing and regulation and its relationship to depression?
Yeah, so in terms of daily experience of emotion, people with depression, not surprisingly, report greater levels of negative emotion in daily life and lower levels of positive emotion in daily life. That has been well replicated by many groups. A second feature that seems to have been replicated several times is that people with greater levels of depression experience a greater variability of emotion. So that is kind of their highs and lows are larger and more frequent than somebody who is not depressed in their daily life. And some people suggest that signal of greater variability of positive and negative emotion in daily life comes from deficits or challenges in emotional regulation. That is, if something happens that really upsets you, for instance, you may stay there for longer, and it may take longer to come to some baseline. Similarly, some of our work suggests that in response to surprising good things, people who are more depressed have less of a positive emotional response to good things, essentially. So there is evidence that people with depression have kind of baseline differences in their positive and negative emotional states, as well as differences in how they respond to events that are personally meaningful, that are causing the emotion in them.
So why is depression specifically linked to emotion, unlike other disorders?
Can you what do you mean by unlike other disorders?
Unlike, say, anxiety disorders or...
I mean, most internalizing disorders like depression, like generalized anxiety, like social anxiety, like obsessive compulsive disorder, like PTSD, are to some degree or another disorders of emotion. Okay. So people with symptoms in any of those spaces have you might call them abnormalities or just differences in the type and frequency of emotions that they experience in daily life. Even schizophrenia, for instance. People with schizophrenia typically have what's called anhedonia, which is a blunted positive emotional reaction to good things or rewards, in the same way that people with depression often have anhedonia. So many of the disorders, psychiatric disorders that we often talk about, there is an affective component to them. And I would argue that that's kind of a key part of how to define most psychiatric disorders.
That's really interesting because most people kind of think of depression as being all about emotion, but it's interesting to know that actually all of the psychopathological disorders have some kind of link to emotion regulation.
Yeah, I mean, so, there were some early models of depression anxiety. So depression is not a standalone thing. So if you look at the rates of depression and anxiety in the population, people with depression tend to also have anxiety. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though depression is this clean, pure category that if you have depression, that's what you have, and you don't have anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like you have cancer and that means has nothing to do with heart disease or something like that, right? So if you have depression, the chances that you have an anxiety disorder are at least 50%. So they're very, what's called comorbid. Mm. They co-occur at very, very high rates. And some of the more influential early models of the comorbidity, the co-occurrence of depression and anxiety, is that depression and anxiety share heightened negative affect. That people with depression or comorbid depression and anxiety or just anxiety, one of the things that kind of unites them is this tendency to experience heightened negative emotion in daily life or in response to something that's disappointing. So even though we call depression one thing and we call anxiety a different thing, they co-occur quite frequently, and there are real-world emotional features that come along with that co-occurrence.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned this already, but you said that individuals with depression, they typically present with difficulty maintaining positive emotions. So one terminology for that you study is the temporal dynamics of affect. So regarding this temporal dynamics of affect, we know that these individuals have difficulty maintaining. Are there individuals what is the difference between these individuals who have difficulty maintaining versus individuals who are able to maintain positive affect for a longer duration in terms of like the circuits of the brain?
Yeah, well, we don't 100% know the biological reasons why somebody is able to, let's say, sustain positive emotion and somebody is not. Some of the evidence that we have that supports those differences come down to reward centers of the brain. So there's some evidence in humans that the ability of reward-related regions of the brain, these evolutionarily old regions like the nucleus accumbens, appear to differentiate people with depression and those without depression, or those with high levels of well-being and those with lower levels of well-being, such that people without depression or people with high levels of well-being, psychological well-being, tend to be able to engage these reward-related regions more easily over time when presented with positive stimuli. So if you present somebody who has high levels of psychological well-being with something that's pleasurable or pleasant or rewarding, they tend to be able to engage these reward-related brain regions more easily across time. In contrast, somebody with depression may be able to engage those same networks early on, but over time, those regions kind of get exhausted, essentially, and do not maintain their engagement over time.
So is this, I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is this something that they would kind of always have that issue of engaging those regions, or is it something that is a change that can happen where somebody is able to easily engage, for example, the nucleus accumbens, and then later on their mood state changes or they become clinically depressed and now they can't?
Yeah, nobody's ever done those kind of prospective longitudinal studies to definitively answer that question. My guess, though, is that it is not something that they were born with. You know, depression emerges after a series of life experiences that are often chronic and stressful, unpredictable, in which they don't have control over their environments. And when that happens, one of the logical responses is to kind of shut down, like to form a belief that you don't have control over the world is going to be stressful, it's going to present things to you that are going to be very hard, and you have no control over them. And one of the things that happens as a result of those types of experiences is to find things less pleasurable and rewarding, because your belief is that the world doesn't have much to offer you. And if it does, you don't have control over it anyway. So that kind of set of experiences shapes the brain fundamentally, and shapes the brain in a way in which the ability of reward centers to respond, especially if you're thinking, man, this is one good thing, but it's going to be fleeting and I'm not going to have control over it, shuts down those centers' kind of responsivity over time.
So kind of related to that, can you explain the concept of repetitive negative thinking and its role as a risk factor for various psychiatric disorders, including depression?
Yeah, so repetitive negative thinking is a construct or an idea that was put forward probably about 10 or 15 years ago to unite different what are called cognitive risk factors for internalizing disorders. So, for instance, thought tendencies, cognitive tendencies like rumination, to chew on something that happened in the past over and over and over again, worry, to be thinking about something that you have no control over in the future over and over and over again, post-event processing, thinking about some social experience or a social interaction you had that you think you screwed up on over and over and over again. There are many others, but there was over 30 years or so in the psychology literature a proliferation of these ideas, all of which had a core common concept of the repetitive or habitual process of thinking negatively to yourself. So rumination is associated with depression more, and worry is more associated with generalized anxiety, and post-event processing may be associated with social anxiety. But they share a huge common feature, which is the tendency for an individual to engage in habitual, repetitive thoughts to themselves that are negative in content. So the idea of repetitive negative thinking is that the commonality of these different concepts is that they all kind of share this core thing with one another. And that thing is the tendency to think negatively to yourself about the future or the past or some social experience. And they all predict internalizing psychiatric symptoms like depression, like generalized anxiety, like social anxiety. And going back to what we talked about earlier, that can explain some of the comorbidity or co-occurrence among depression, anxiety, social anxiety, OCD, stuff like that.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I can imagine, like, as you said, you're thinking about the past in a negative way and ruminating on it. That kind of would be linked to depression. And if you're thinking negatively about the future, that's more kind of in the umbrella of anxiety and those types of feelings.
But they all have that commonality of this repetitive thinking.
Yeah. So you've studied the connection between, one of the things you studied is the connection between the prefrontal cortex, which is known for its role in executive function, and then the amygdala, which is known to be involved in emotion. So you studied the connection between these two areas in emotion regulation. Could you break down that relationship for our listeners and explain how it might be altered in conditions like depression or anxiety?
Sure. So, the amygdala is involved in really salience detection. So in essence, detecting whether there is something in the environment that is a threat or an opportunity. So, if you're just like at home and nothing's happening, then the amygdala is not firing. But if something jumps out at you, the amygdala is going to turn on and detect that surprising thing is there, may require additional attention and processing to determine or to appraise whether or not it is a opportunity or a threat, that kind of thing. When people are detecting salient events in their world all the time, sometimes it is useful for the brain to be able to say, well, wait a minute, that threat is over. Let's refocus our attention on what we need to do right at this moment. And so it is thought that one of the roles of the prefrontal cortex in emotional regulation is essentially being able to take in the current context of where the person is at that moment and say, you know what, that threat is over, or that opportunity is over, the salient stimulus is gone. Let's redirect our attention and focus on whatever it is we need to do at that moment. And if we link it back to the concept of repetitive negative thinking, as you said, one of the things that is characteristic of repetitive negative thinking is that habitual loop of thought, of thinking that something bad is going to happen or has happened over and over and over again, without really taking yourself out of that loop and focusing on, what job you have to do today, or being with your kids, or whatever that is. And so it is thought that the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate subcortical structures like the amygdala is key for basically being able to take yourself out of that emotion generating space and focus on what it is that you may have to be doing or will be wanting to do at that moment.
Yeah, so kind of related to that, we touched on the amygdala brain structure. What about the striatum? So I know you've also done work on the frontostriatal reward circuit. So with the prefrontal cortex connections going to the striatum, is it similar to what you just explained right now?
Yeah, it's thought to be quite similar. So both in terms of regulating, detection of salience and negative affective states, the prefrontal cortex is also often thought to be regulating positive affective states, both in terms of being able to maybe savor or sustain positive affective states, or in terms of being able to regulate them down when the reward has ended or the good thing has stopped. Like, so in the case of mania and bipolar disorder, where there is this kind of sustained reward related state where like you think everything is an opportunity, that would be an example of where somebody is in this like approach-related orientation that's out of control basically, and it's causing them some kind of struggle and difficulty.
So we know that emotions can be both positive and negative, and we all associate negative emotions with symptoms of depression, as we discussed earlier. But some of your recent research has been looking more at positive emotions. So what could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so depression, the cardinal symptoms of depression as defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is either the presence of kind of prolonged negative affective states like depressed mood or sad mood, or the inability to experience pleasure. So the inability to experience pleasure is often referred to as anhedonia. And so that is a cardinal symptom of depression, that you can have either sad mood or anhedonia, and that, along with other symptoms, is sufficient for a depression diagnosis. It's thought that anhedonia is, in part, a lack of responsivity to reward. It's like what we were talking about earlier. You get something good that happens, and you maybe don't feel the kind of boost in mood that most other people feel in response to that reward, or you're not willing to put forth the effort to get the reward because you think the reward's not going to be that great anyway. So those are all things that kind of sit under the umbrella of anhedonia or reduced positive affect in depression. And that is as critical as the negative mood. In fact, anhedonia is often harder to treat than depressed mood in depression. It doesn't respond as well to psychotropic medications like Prozac and stuff like that. So in some ways, in the current state of the literature, figuring out how to treat anhedonia is a more kind of critical issue that we're facing than just dealing with the sad mood part of depression.
Yeah. So let's talk about stress. So how does stress affect brain function and structure, particularly in these regions that are involved in emotional processing? And are these effects reversible?
Yeah, so I mean, stress is a concept that is very kind of wiggly and hard to define. So one of the things that I think you first have to do when you talk about stress is say, what is stress? How can we define it in a way that when you call it stress, I know what you're calling stress, and we all call it the same thing. So how we think about stress is some kind of event that basically like presents a threat to the organism, to the person, and it can be categorized as either being controllable or uncontrollable. So stress that you find controllable, like exercise is a form of stress. If you choose to exercise, that's actually quite healthy, right? That's good for both the brain and the body. But stress that is that you perceive as being uncontrollable, something that you have no control over, can be quite detrimental. So how you make sense of the stress that is happening to you is a key feature in determining whether it's good for you or bad for you. Okay, and so stress, when it's perceived as especially uncontrollable, has quite negative brain effects. So stress facilitates the release of cortisol into the bloodstream, and if that happens chronically, repeatedly over and over and over again, what you get neural degeneration in key regions of the brain, like the hippocampus. So sustained or chronic uncontrollable stress leads to retraction of brain cells in the hippocampus. That is something that we see characteristically in people with depression. So there are these very clear changes in the brain as a result of chronic and unpredictable stress that, when people get better as a result of treatment, appear to be reversed to some degree. So you get changes to the brain both in response to chronic stress that is often associated with something like depression, and you also get some reversal of these same brain changes when somebody is treated successfully.
So one of the things we're always interested in learning about here is cognitive health, and especially cognitive health across the lifespan. So how do our emotional states change across the lifespan?
So there seem to be clear changes in emotion across age. So in the ages of like the 40s or 50s, when people tend to be raising a family and stuff like that, you often see decreases in well-being actually, and in their ratings of their emotion in daily life, just because I think life is stressful and stuff like that. And then as they enter senescence, like the 60s and 70s, you see a recovery in their emotional states, right? Their tendency to experience positive emotion, stuff like that. When people, as they age, if they report experiencing and having a high level of purpose in life, like a sense of like, this is why I'm still living and doing the things I'm doing, that seems to be key for predicting a whole host of really positive health outcomes in aging. So a sense of like purpose in life is really important. But there's this really interesting decrease in well-being and positive emotion in this kind of like 40s to 50s range that often recovers as they pass through that into kind of somewhat later years.
So are there actual neural differences that you see in different age groups with regard to emotion processing?
Honestly, that's like not my area of research, so I don't have a clear answer for that.
Okay. So, do you want to go?
So how does depression or emotional regulation relate to cognitive health as we're aging? How important is it for, either maintaining cognitive health as an individual is getting older?
Yeah, so I think that doing things that continue to challenge the mind are key for both emotional well-being and for cognitive well-being. So in rodent models like mice and rat studies, putting those animals into what are called enriched environments, where there's lots of toys, lots of opportunity to play and explore and to challenge yourself, that's associated with a whole host of affective outcomes, like emotional outcomes, and cognitive outcomes. And we see in our work, similarly, regardless of the age that you are, when you go to more new and diverse places, when you have kind of a day that's highly enriched of new stimulation, you report feeling happier. And when people study superagers, people who are in their 70s and 80s and are showing basically no cognitive decline, one of the things that they seem to be doing is engage in a wide variety of things in their community, such that like they don't just have like the same routine every day. They're doing a whole host of novel and diverse things, which is very reminiscent of these enriched environments that you see these positive outcomes in mice studies and rat studies. So we think that kind of not falling into too much of a routine trap is good for both emotional well-being and is probably quite good for cognitive well-being, especially as people age.
So how do neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's affect emotional processing and regulation? Because there is a relationship with cognitive decline and depression as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is not like an area of expertise of mine, but people with cognitive decline do have changes in their emotion. Often they can be more emotionally impulsive and stuff like that. So it seems clear, and I think people with Alzheimer's are at heightened risk for things like depression. So, I don't think it's really been uncovered the degree to which some of these measures of exploration and engagement with new and diverse things can kind of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. But my sense is that kind of engagement is going to be really important for both cognitive health and emotional health as people age, and maybe as a potential way to ward off like cognitive decline and dementia and stuff.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier. You mentioned the hippocampus structure in individuals with depression tends to show some bit of neurodegeneration. How do emotions influence memory formation and recall? Do individuals with depression tend to, show memory impairments or difficulties with memory? Yeah, so
we obviously remember emotional things better than mundane things, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'll remember my first kiss for my entire life, and I will forget whatever I had for lunch last Tuesday very quickly, right? So we remember highly emotional things much, much better than we remember mundane things. And depression, in part by virtue of affecting the hippocampus, has clear changes in memory, basically. So people with depression tend to have somewhat worse memory for things, but it's quite interesting because their worse memory is really defined by an overgeneralization of autobiographical memory. So that is that if you ask them to describe, a concert that they went to last year, they don't go into much detail. They have difficulty accessing the detail to describe all of the specific things about going to the Bruce Springsteen concert or something like that. They will talk in generalities, like I went to this concert and it was fun or something like that. But somebody who is not depressed, you ask them the same question, the same time frame, and they'll be able to give a whole host of really rich details of the experience. And it's thought that the neurodegeneration of the hippocampus that results from chronic and unpredictable stress associated with depression is the cause of these overgeneralized, non-specific autobiographical memories that you tend to see in people who have depression.
I mean, it kind of feeds into that whole, when you were talking about the anhedonia and, not being able to activate reward circuits and take in those positive experiences because they are not going to they're kind of going to gloss over the positive parts of, say, attending that concert and then just see it under the cloud of the generally kind of depressed nature that they have and focus on those aspects as well. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that one of the key things when you do treat somebody with depression is to help them see that their experiences that they're having are better than they expect, and for those to stand out so that the patient can integrate that in with their self-view, can update their view of the world as no longer being stressful and unpredictable and they have no control, to being one where there are opportunities for reward and pleasure. But if the hippocampus is shrunken in size and they're unable or having a difficult time distinguishing experiences in memory as this was actually not that bad, this was really fun, and this was fun, and this was fun, from their kind of more blah life that had been happening, then that's going to make it difficult for them to integrate those new experiences for what they really were into their new kind of self-view.
I'm kind of curious, these individuals who are depressed and tend to have this negative thinking style, kind of what we talked about, the ruminative negative thinking, are they more likely to remember these negative events, and that kind of puts them in this cycle rather than them remembering the positive events? Do we see this in research?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
So they're more. So it's not necessarily that they have the bad memory generally. Is that the case? They can pick up on negative. So
they have a good memory for bad things.
They have a good memory for bad things, basically.
So both are true. So they have they are more likely to recall negative events that happen to them than good events. And in general, both for good and bad things, their memory is less kind of specific. So they have the kind of overgeneralized autobiographical memory for both positive and negative events. But and under free recall conditions, when they're just able to kind of report how their last month was, they will tend to report more negative things, even though there's not a lot of richness and episodic richness there. So both things happen in people with depression.
Got it.
So how do early life experiences shape the development of emotional processing systems in the brain? Are there critical periods for this development?
Sure, of course. This has been known for a very, very long time now, that, from birth, the infant is forming attachment associations with their parental figures to learn whether the environment is predictable, whether the environment is safe, whether their needs will get met. That forms the foundation for a child's worldview for their entire life, basically. The work on Romanian orphanages, for instance, is really kind of remarkable in this vein. So, at the fall of the Soviet Union, Westerners were able to go in and look at orphanages in Romania that were really poorly staffed, where there were 20, 30, 50, 100 kids per nurse. So many of them were receiving very poor care. But many of them were adopted into the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they were studied here once they came and were adopted by parents of middle class or upper middle class means in the United States. And not surprisingly, what they found was that the longer a child was institutionalized and the earlier the child was institutionalized, the worse the outcome was, even if they were adopted into an upper middle class home here in the United States, which suggests that there are these really key early periods in how an infant or child forms its belief systems about the world. Are my needs going to get met? Am I safe? If I cry, does someone come and soothe me? Those are the foundational building blocks of everything that comes afterwards, really. So, yes, there are critical periods. There are obviously later critical periods in adolescence where kids are really exploring on their own, first taking their feet and dipping them in the water of independence. So those are other critical periods, but early life is like very, very important.
Can you discuss any interventions or strategies that your research suggests might be particularly effective for maintaining or improving emotional well-being, especially in older adults?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily particularly for older adults. I think that a key thing in maintaining emotional health is really a couple of things. One is continuing to engage in new and diverse experiences. That is not being afraid of something that is unknown or uncertain, but trying out new things. That really challenges our mind and our brain, because when you go to a new place that you've never been to before or a new social situation, you kind of have to, like, it's like working a muscle, right? It's like being in a space that you're not sure how it's going to work out, but you're putting yourself out there anyway. So it gives you an opportunity to learn that the world is not as scary as maybe you think it is. And that kind of experience, those kinds of learning opportunities are key to continuing to challenge the brain and typically are associated with improvements in mood, even if it's transitory, even if it's kind of fleeting. Another key thing that I mentioned earlier is the sense and purpose in life, is as you age, staying engaged in things that matter to you is very important for this higher level sense of importance of what you're doing and engagement with life. So I think those two things are important for both emotional health as well as for cognitive health.
So how do you see the field of affective neuroscience evolving in the next decade, and what do you think will be the most significant areas of progress?
Well, I think that one of the key things is going to be to use events that matter to people to really understand what is happening in the brain when people have emotional experiences. So up until now, most affective neuroscience has used these standardized and relatively artificial stimuli to evoke emotion in the lab, which has been very helpful, but in the end is probably not doing as good of a job as we need to really understand the dynamics of the brain when somebody is experiencing emotion. And that leads to a second point, which is if we're going to understand how the brain responds to emotional stimuli, is to really take into account these temporal dynamics, how the brain is changing moment to moment over time in response to events that matter to people that are these really strong affective events. So I think those two things are critical to advance the field, to understand individual differences, to understand the biological bases of emotion.
Okay, so that's been really interesting learning about your work. Where could our listeners learn more about your research?
Well, you could go to my website, manateelab.org, where we put all of our papers online and describe some of the projects that are ongoing. Okay,
great. So thank you again, Dr. Heller, for sharing your expertise with us today and for the incredible work you're doing to understand the neural mechanisms involved in depression, in anxiety and well-being. And we look forward to hearing more about your research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the CVL podcast. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts or look for episodes on our website where you can also learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity. Just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research, as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.